The air feels wrong. Not dangerous, not toxic, just heavier. You inhale, and it's almost too easy, like your lungs don't have to work as hard, like the atmosphere itself is feeding you. The forest stretches endlessly in every direction. Towering trunks rise like pillars, their surfaces rough and ancient. No birds sing, no mammals move through the undergrowth. Instead, there's a different sound, a low, rhythmic hum. It vibrates through the air. You look up. Something passes between the trees, fast, silent, controlled. At first, your brain refuses to process it. The proportions don't make sense. Then it turns. Wings catch the light. Transparent, veined, enormous. A dragonfly, but not the kind you've ever seen. Its wingspan is wider than your outstretched arms. Its body is thick, armored, built for power. Its eyes, vast, reflective, scan the world below with mechanical precision. It circles once, then disappears into the canopy. And suddenly, the forest feels different. Because here, you are not at the top of the food chain. Here, the sky belongs to something else. This is not a fantasy. This is Earth. Hundreds of millions of years before dinosaurs, this planet was ruled by giants. Not reptiles, not mammals, but insects.
When we imagine prehistoric Earth, we tend to jump to a familiar image: massive dinosaurs roaming vast landscapes, dominating everything in sight. But that image skips a chapter, a very long chapter. Dinosaurs did not appear until roughly 230 million years ago, during the late Triassic period. By then, Earth had already been alive for billions of years. Complex ecosystems had formed, collapsed, and reformed again. To find the age of giant insects, we have to go further back, around 300 million years ago, a period known as the Carboniferous. The world is almost unrecognizable. The continents are arranged differently, slowly drifting toward the formation of a supercontinent. The climate is warm, intensely humid, and saturated with life. Vast swamp forests dominate the landscape, stretching across what will one day become North America, Europe, and Asia. But these are not forests as we know them. No flowering plants, no grasses, no trees with familiar leaves. Instead, the land is covered in towering lycophytes, giant horsetails, and dense ferns. Some of these plants rise over 30 meters tall, forming thick, shadowy canopies. The ground is soft, waterlogged, layered with decaying vegetation. It is a world of green abundance. And in this environment, life does something extraordinary. It scales up. Insects, already one of the most adaptable forms of life, begin to grow to sizes that seem impossible today. Dragonflies evolve into aerial predators with wingspans exceeding 70 centimeters. Millipedes stretch to lengths over 2 meters. Massive cockroach-like insects scuttle through the undergrowth. This is not a world where insects are background noise. They are dominant. They fill the skies, the forest floor, and everything in between. And yet, this creates a paradox, because insects, by their very biology, should not be able to grow this large. They lack lungs. They rely on passive oxygen diffusion. Their exoskeletons impose structural limits. So how did this happen? What allowed this brief, extraordinary moment in Earth's history where insects broke the rules? And just as importantly, why did it end? To understand this world, we need to look at something we cannot see: the composition of the air itself. Today, Earth's atmosphere contains about 21% oxygen. This balance is the result of a dynamic equilibrium between photosynthesis, respiration, and geological processes. But during the Carboniferous period, this balance shifted dramatically. Geochemical evidence, Drawn from fossilized plant material and isotopic analysis, and supported by research published in journals like Nature and Science, suggests that oxygen levels may have risen between 30 and 35%. That difference may sound small. It is not. It represents a fundamental change in how life interacts with the environment. For insects, oxygen is not transported through blood using lungs, as it is in mammals or reptiles. Instead, insects breathe through a network of microscopic tubes called trachea. These tubes branch throughout their bodies, delivering oxygen directly to tissues through diffusion. Diffusion is simple but limited. It works efficiently over short distances. But as body size increases, diffusion becomes less effective. Oxygen cannot travel quickly enough to sustain large, energy-demanding tissues. This is one of the main reasons modern insects remain small. But increase the oxygen concentration in the air, and diffusion becomes far more powerful. The gradient between the outside environment and the insect's internal tissues becomes steeper. Oxygen moves faster, it penetrates deeper. In effect, the environment compensates for the limitations of the insect's biology. This is not just theory. Modern experiments have tested it. When insects are raised in environments with higher oxygen levels, they grow larger, not infinitely, but noticeably. Now imagine that effect acting over millions of years. Natural selection would favor individuals capable of taking advantage of this oxygen-rich environment. Gradually, generation by generation, body sizes increase, until we arrive at creatures like Meganeura, a prehistoric relative of dragonflies, with wingspans rivaling modern birds. But oxygen alone does not explain dominance. For that, we need to consider competition. During the Carboniferous period, vertebrate life was still evolving. Early amphibians existed, but they were largely tied to water. Their ability to dominate terrestrial ecosystems was limited. More importantly, there were no flying vertebrates. No birds, no bats, no pterosaurs. The skies were empty. And in evolution, empty space is opportunity. Insects were the first animals to evolve powered flight, an innovation that changed the trajectory of life on Earth. Wings allowed them to escape predators, explore new habitats, and access resources unavailable to ground-bound organisms. Flight also created a new dimension of ecological dominance, and with no competitors in the air, insects expanded into this space without resistance. Size became an advantage. Larger wings generated more lift, larger bodies could travel farther, hunt more effectively, and avoid threats. The skies became their territory. Meanwhile, on the forest floor, other arthropods flourished. Creatures like Arthropleura, a massive multi-segmented millipede, moved through dense vegetation, feeding on decaying plant matter. Fossil trackways suggest these animals could reach lengths exceeding 2 meters. They were not predators. They didn't need to be. The environment itself provided abundance. The Carboniferous forests were among the most productive ecosystems in Earth's history. Massive amounts of plant material accumulated, much of it eventually buried and preserved, forming the coal deposits we still mine today. Food was plentiful, oxygen was abundant, competition was limited. These conditions created a perfect evolutionary window, a moment where the constraints of biology were temporarily relaxed. And in that window, insects grew into giants.
At first, this ancient world can feel distant, a strange, almost alien chapter in Earth's history. Giant dragonflies, massive millipedes, dense, oxygen-rich air. It seems disconnected from anything we experience today. But the deeper you look, the more familiar it becomes, because the forces that shaped that world are still shaping ours. The story of giant insects is not really about insects. It's about systems. It's about how the chemistry of the atmosphere, the structure of ecosystems, and the direction of evolution are all connected, tightly, continuously, and often invisibly. During the Carboniferous period, something extraordinary happened on a planetary scale. Forests expanded across vast regions of the Earth. These plants absorbed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, converting it into organic matter, wood, leaves, roots. But unlike today, much of that plant material did not fully decompose. Instead, it accumulated, layer upon layer, buried under sediment, cut off from oxygen. Over millions of years, this process locked away enormous amounts of carbon. The result was a gradual reduction in atmospheric carbon dioxide and a corresponding increase in oxygen. This wasn't a small fluctuation. It was a transformation of the planet's atmosphere. And that transformation reshaped life itself. Insects grew larger, ecosystems expanded, entire ecological roles emerged that had never existed before. Now fast forward to the present. Humans have discovered those ancient carbon deposits: coal, oil, natural gas. These are not just energy sources. They are the compressed remains of that carboniferous world. And when we burn them, we reverse the process. Carbon that was locked away for hundreds of millions of years is released back into the atmosphere in a matter of centuries. Carbon dioxide levels rise, global temperatures increase, climate systems begin to shift. This is not speculation. It is measured, observed, and studied by scientific institutions around the world, from climate research organizations to agencies like NASA and NOAA. We are altering the same atmospheric balance that once allowed giant insects to exist. Not in the same direction, but with equally profound consequences. Because the atmosphere is not just a backdrop, it is an active force. It determines how organisms breathe, grow, and survive. It influences weather patterns, ocean currents, and the distribution of ecosystems across the planet. Change the atmosphere, and you change the rules of life. The Carboniferous period is proof of that. It shows us that when atmospheric conditions shift, life responds. Sometimes gradually, sometimes dramatically. Species adapt, they migrate, they evolve new traits, or fail to keep up. And over time, entire ecosystems can be replaced. Now consider our position in this process. For most of Earth's history, these changes occurred slowly, over millions of years, driven by volcanic activity, tectonic shifts, and long-term biological cycles. Today, the timeline is different. Human activity is accelerating change. In just a few centuries, we have increased atmospheric carbon dioxide to levels not seen in hundreds of thousands of years. We are altering global temperatures, melting ice sheets, and shifting weather patterns. Ecosystems are already responding. Species are moving towards cooler regions, some are declining, others are expanding. The balance is changing again. And while we are unlikely to see dragonflies the size of birds return, the principle remains exactly the same. Life adapts to the environment it is given. The Carboniferous world reminds us that what feels normal today is not permanent. At one point, high oxygen levels allowed insects to grow beyond what we now consider possible. At another, massive reptiles dominated land, sea, and sky. Later, mammals rose to prominence. Each era feels stable, until it isn't. And that leads to a deeper, more uncomfortable question. What happens when the environment changes faster than life can adapt? In the past, transitions between dominant groups often involved extinctions, sometimes gradual, sometimes catastrophic. The fossil record is filled with examples of species that could not keep up. Today, scientists are observing similar patterns. Biodiversity loss is accelerating, habitats are shrinking, environmental pressures are increasing. We are not just witnessing change, we are driving it. And yet, the lesson of the Carboniferous period is not just about loss, it is also about resilience. Insects did not disappear when their age of giants ended. They adapted. They became smaller, more efficient, more specialized. They survived. In fact, they went on to become one of the most successful groups of organisms in Earth's history. That duality, fragility, and resilience is at the heart of life on this planet. Conditions change. Some forms disappear. Others transform and continue. So when we look back at a world where insects ruled the skies, we are not just looking at a curiosity of the past. We are looking at a system in motion, a system that is still moving, still changing, and now, for the first time in Earth's history, being shaped intentionally by a single species. The question is no longer whether change will happen. It already is. The question is, what kind of world will emerge from it? And who will be able to survive in it?
For millions of years, the Carboniferous world remained stable. Oxygen levels stayed high. Forests stretched across continents. Insects filled the skies, the ground, and the spaces in between. It was a system in balance, productive, expansive, and for a time, remarkably consistent. But on Earth, stability is never permanent. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the planet began to change. The continents continued their gradual drift, moving toward the formation of a vast supercontinent. As land masses shifted, so did ocean currents and atmospheric circulation patterns. Rainfall distribution changed. Seasons became more pronounced in certain regions. The warm, wet conditions that had sustained the great swamp forests began to break down. In many areas, the climate grew drier. The endless wetlands that had once dominated the landscape started to shrink, fragmenting into smaller ecosystems. the dense plant life that had fueled the Carboniferous oxygen surge began to decline. And with that decline came a critical shift in the atmosphere. The massive burial of plant material that had locked away carbon and allowed oxygen levels to rise was no longer happening at the same scale. Decomposition processes began to catch up. Carbon dioxide slowly increased, and oxygen levels began to fall. Not suddenly, but steadily. From their peak, estimated above 30%, oxygen concentrations moved downward, approaching levels closer to what we experience today. For most forms of life, this change was manageable. For giant insects, it was a turning point. Their entire biology had been shaped around an oxygen-rich world. Their tracheal systems, efficient under high oxygen conditions, began to reach their limits as concentrations dropped. Diffusion, once sufficient to deliver oxygen throughout large bodies, became less effective. Large insects faced a problem that smaller ones did not. They could no longer get enough oxygen to sustain their size. Growth became restricted. Metabolism became less efficient. Over generations, natural selection began to favor smaller body sizes, organisms that could function effectively within the new atmospheric limits. The giants did not vanish overnight, but their era was ending. At the same time, another transformation was underway. Reptiles were evolving. Unlike amphibians, they were no longer tied to water for reproduction. Their eggs could survive on land, allowing them to expand into drier environments. Their bodies were better suited for a changing climate. They were more independent, more adaptable. And as ecosystems shifted, they began to fill roles that had previously been limited or unavailable. But the most significant development was still to come: the conquest of the sky by a new kind of organism. Until this point, insects had dominated the air simply because no one else was there. Flight had given them access to a dimension that was otherwise empty. But evolution rarely leaves such opportunities unchallenged. During the late Triassic period, the first flying vertebrates appeared: pterosaurs. These were not insects, they were reptiles, animals with internal skeletons, powerful muscles, and highly efficient respiratory systems. Unlike the tracheal system of insects, pterosaurs used lungs that could actively pump air, allowing for continuous oxygen flow and far greater efficiency. This gave them a critical advantage. They could grow larger, fly longer distances, sustain higher levels of activity, and perhaps most importantly, adapt more effectively to environments where oxygen levels were lower. The skies were no longer uncontested. For the first time, insects faced direct competition in the air. And not just competition, but competition from organisms that were better equipped for the changing conditions. The balance began to shift. Large insects, already struggling with reduced oxygen availability, now had to compete with faster, more efficient flyers. Predation pressures increased. Ecological niches that had once been exclusively theirs were now shared or taken. In evolution, pressure drives change. Species either adapt or they decline. For giant insects, the combination of environmental change and biological competition proved decisive. Over millions of years, their sizes decreased. Their dominance faded. They did not disappear, but they transformed. Smaller, more efficient forms persisted, better suited to the new atmospheric conditions and the increasingly competitive ecosystems. By the time dinosaurs rose to prominence in the Jurassic period, the age of giant insects had already passed into history. The skies that once belonged to massive dragonfly-like predators were now shared and eventually dominated by entirely different forms of life. What remains is not just a story of extinction. It is a story of transition. A reminder that even the most successful organisms are bound by the conditions that support them. Change those conditions, and dominance can dissolve. The Carboniferous giants were not flawed. They were perfectly adapted to their world. But their world did not last. And when it changed, they had to change with it. Some did, others could not. And in that shift, a new era began. One that would eventually make room for the rise of dinosaurs. But beneath that new world, hidden in stone, the evidence remains. Proof that before reptiles ruled the earth, before dinosaurs defined prehistory, there was another age. An age where insects were not small, unnoticed creatures,
but the undisputed giants of the sky.
Today, insects are everywhere. They move through the edges of our world, hovering over water, crawling through soil, drifting unnoticed through the air. They are so common, so small, that we rarely stop to consider them as anything more than background life. A flicker, a buzz, a passing detail. But hidden within their existence is a memory, a deep, ancient memory, written not in behavior, but in biology. Because the insects we see today are not new, they are survivors, descendants of a world that once operated under entirely different rules. A world where the air itself allowed life to expand beyond the limits we now take for granted, where ecosystems supported sizes and structures that feel almost impossible from our modern perspective. There was a time when a dragonfly was not something you could ignore. It was something you would notice immediately, something that commanded space in the sky, something that, for a brief moment in Earth's history, stood at the top of its world. That world is gone, not because it failed, but because it changed. The atmosphere shifted, the climate transformed, new competitors emerged, and the delicate balance that had allowed giant insects to exist slowly disappeared. And yet, insects did not vanish with it. They adapted. They became smaller, more efficient, more versatile. They moved into new niches, survived new pressures, and continued forward as the planet reshaped itself again and again. In many ways, their story is not one of loss, but of persistence. Because survival on Earth has never been about remaining the same. It has always been about responding to change. The age of giant insects reminds us of something easy to forget. What we see today is not the final version of life. It is only the current version. At different points in Earth's history, different rules have applied, different forms have risen, different systems have dominated, and each time it has felt permanent, until it wasn't. Now, for the first time, one species has begun to influence those rules directly. We are altering the atmosphere, shifting the climate, reshaping ecosystems on a global scale. The same forces that once allowed insects to become giants and then forced them to shrink are being set in motion again, but this time faster, more abruptly, and with consequences we are only beginning to understand. The lesson of that ancient world is not that giants once existed, it is that conditions define possibility. Change the conditions, and you change what life can become. So when you see a dragonfly today, hovering quietly over a pond, its wings catching the light, it is easy to overlook it, easy to dismiss it as something small. But look closer, because what you are seeing is not just an insect, it is a remnant, a living echo of a time when the sky belonged to creatures like it, only larger, more powerful, shaped by a world that no longer exists. A reminder that Earth has been many different worlds before, and will be many different worlds again. The giants are gone, but their story remains, carried forward in the smallest wings that still remember how to fly.